There is no era as significant in 20th century history as the Cold War. From 1947 to 1991, this conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union was not merely a military standoff, it influenced ideology, economy, and culture. Today, we will reflect on the history of the Cold War, exploring its formation, development, and the impact it had on the world thereafter. Origins and background of the Cold War. The origins of the Cold War are deeply tied to the end of World War II and the subsequent changes in the international order. With the war's conclusion, Europe lay in ruins, and a new international order was sought. The two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, emerged as victors, yet they harbored fundamental ideological differences. The US valued capitalism and democracy, while the Soviet Union promoted communism and a centrally planned economy. The US aimed to establish leadership in the post-war world, while the Soviet Union sought to expand its political system. This ideological clash transcended mere post-war arrangements, reflecting differing visions for the future international order. In 1947, the US announced the Truman Doctrine, declaring active intervention to prevent the spread of communism. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union strengthened its influence over Eastern European countries and established the Comecon, Council for Mutual Economic Assistance, in 1949. These actions heralded the dawn of the Cold War. Early conflicts and major events. Several events symbolize the tensions of the early Cold War. One such event was the Berlin Blockade from 1948 to 1949, where the Soviet Union blocked West Berlin, cutting off land supply routes. This led to the US and its allies supplying goods via airlift, breaking the blockade and intensifying Cold War tensions. In 1949, the Soviet Union successfully tested its first atomic bomb, initiating a nuclear arms race between the US and the USSR. The Korean War erupted in the 1950s, expanding the proxy war between the two superpowers into Asia, clarifying the structure of the Cold War and highlighting new aspects of US-Soviet rivalry. The Cuban crisis and its impact. The Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962 was one of the greatest crises of the Cold War. The Soviet Union deployed nuclear missiles in Cuba, posing a direct threat to the US. In response, the US implemented a naval blockade and demanded the removal of the missiles. Both nations' leaders began negotiations to ease tensions, ultimately resulting in the Soviet withdrawal of missiles and a US promise to remove missiles from Turkey. This crisis underscored the fear of nuclear war and clarified the risks of the Cold War. While it temporarily eased tensions, it also perpetuated the arms race and espionage activities between the US and the USSR. Détente and renewed Cold War. The 1970s saw a temporary easing of Cold War tensions, known as détente. US President Richard Nixon and Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev engaged in dialogue, reaching agreements on arms reduction through Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, SALT. In 1972, Nixon's visit to Moscow marked a significant step toward improving US-Soviet relations. However, détente was short-lived, and tensions escalated again in the 1980s. US President Ronald Reagan adopted a hardline stance against the Soviet Union, countering its military buildup. In response, the Soviet Union also intensified its military posture, reigniting the Cold War. Reagan's Star Wars initiative further heightened tensions between the two nations.